Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'm the host of this show, which is Culturally Determined. And my guest today is John Ziegler. John, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I host a nationally syndicated weekend radio talk show called The John and Leah Show. I'm also an author and a documentary filmmaker. People probably know me best for my movie about the 2008 presidential election called Media Malpractice: How Obama Got Elected. I'm also well known for my work on the so-called Penn State scandal, which has been quite contrarian to the conventional wisdom that the media created in that story. And I'm also, I guess, known based upon your experience as a guy who was the subject of a 23-page cover story in Atlantic magazine by David Foster Wallace. So I'm known for a lot of different, I'm known a little bit for a lot of different things.
Yeah, so you're kind of a Renaissance man. And the reason we're having this conversation is I read an essay that you published on the website Media, if that's how you pronounce that website. And the title of that essay is How and Why the Conservative Media Sold Its Soul to Facilitate Trump's Nomination. And I thought this was a really interesting piece and kind of jived with some stuff that I was thinking about and kind of writing and tweeting about. And so we're going to talk about that. And then in this, maybe the second half or second third or whatever, or last third of the conversation, we'll talk about, so you were profiled by David Foster Wallace in the Atlantic Monthly, and it ended up in this book, Consider the Lobster. And I'm a big David Foster Wallace fan, and he, of course, committed suicide in 2008. I think the piece that he wrote was one of the last big pieces that he published in a major magazine. He published a piece on Roger Federer, but it's a very interesting piece. So we're going to talk about that and kind of like what it was like to be the subject of a profile like that. Okay, so this piece, which we'll link to, about Trump and the media, I'm just going to read the first paragraph about this, and then I'll ask you to kind of like talk about the piece in general. So you write, I've written many times on this outlet about the dangers of Donald Trump's candidacy. Last year, I predicted how the conservative media was going to allow him to at least negatively alter the process, if not win the GOP nomination. Now that he's effectively clinched that nomination, or at least created a situation where it would require an unprecedented act to stop him, someone needs to explain from a media perspective how and why this happened. Since no other conservative has both the guts and the knowledge to do so, I guess that person will be me. And you kind of go from there. So I encourage everyone to read this, but we're going to have this conversation in a way that you won't have had to read the essay, but I encourage everyone to check it out. So what... Can you kind of like lay out the thesis of this piece?
Well, this piece was actually many years in the making. As a matter of fact, I had written a book proposal before the 2012 election called A Business, Not a Cause. And the thesis there was that the conservative media was actually going to facilitate Barack Obama's reelection, not in a conspiratorial way. I want to make something very clear. I am not a conspiracy guy at all. In fact, I'm an anti-conspiracy guy. I don't think human beings are smart enough to pull off conspiracies. I have dealt with all these people at the very highest level. They're not that bright. This is not the way they work. The world is not a grand conspiracy. However, people do act in their own self-interest. And some people, especially those who have been very successful in the news media, are very good at figuring out what their self-interest is. And it's different than what their customers and their fans think that it is. And the reality that I had perceived back in 2011, 2012, which I didn't get the book written because I'm not a celebrity, and celebrity is all that matters in today's day and age, especially in the literary world. The thesis there was that Obama's re-election was going to be very good economically for the conservative media. And as a matter of fact, there were several media outlets that figured this out in 2008, including Matt Drudge and the Drudge Report, which is a very untold story. I was very close to Andrew Breitbart, who was Matt Drudge's right-hand man at the time during the 2008 election. And I will go to my grave believing strongly that if Matt Drudge had been the normal Matt Drudge on Barack Obama during that Democratic primary, that Hillary Clinton is the Democratic candidate in 2008, and in all likelihood is the President of the United States today. I really do believe that. I can explain that in greater detail if you'd like, but Andrew Breitbart, who's no longer with us, I think would agree with that, because Drudge censored Andrew Breitbart's ability to post negative stories about Barack Obama during that primary, specifically about Reverend Wright. The Reverend Wright story I will also go to my grave believing should have been the end of Obama's candidacy in any rational world. And it was not, largely because of Matt Drudge. So anyway, this story you're referring to that I wrote a couple weeks ago was a long time in coming. And all those realities that I had been warning about for years not only came to fruition with regard to Donald Trump, they exploded like a nuclear weapon in a way that even I didn't fully anticipate, because I don't think anyone understood, at least not at first, what Donald Trump was doing and why his strategy. First of all, my guess is there was a lot of luck involved, because people aren't this smart. But Trump's strategy was even more brilliant than he realized it was, because whether he understood it or not, the conservative media was basically ripe for the taking for this kind of phenomenon, because they're all about ratings and revenue. They're not about the cause. That's the simplest way to explain this, although I do go into much greater detail about the specifics of how the conservative media works, the hierarchy, the cabal, if you will, that Matt Drudge leads, and how this all manifests itself into Donald Trump essentially being the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, which is flat out a ridiculous concept. And it is a ridiculous concept that Donald Trump is likely the GOP presidential nominee.
Okay, so there's a lot there that I want to discuss. Okay, so we have, just to note what things to discuss in this conversation. So we have conspiracy theories that are not really conspiracy theories. We have the effect of Matt Drudge. We have conservative movement, conservative media as a business, not a cause. And we have, Drudge's role in the 2008 election. And there was one more thing that I'm forgetting now, but I'm sure it'll come back to me. So let's talk about businesses and causes. So is that title that you mentioned, is that a reference to the famous saying about every great movement, starts as a movement, becomes a business, and devolves into a racket? Have you heard that saying?
I saw that Bill Kristol used that phrase about a year ago, because I thought, wow, he's somebody that would definitely appreciate the thesis of my book, because that's definitely in my mindset, that it is a racket. The conservative media is a racket. And let's be clear, I have been in the conservative media for a long time. I've dealt with everybody at the highest levels. I mean, almost everybody I've talked about in that column, I've dealt with directly. So I know these people. I know how they operate. I understand the nature of the business. I'm not somebody who's just talking out of my backside here. I mean, I've lived it. And
so what's great about your piece is that, it's almost, it made me think when I was reading it was almost like you were pulling the curtain back and showing, the machinations behind the scenes. Like, not a conspiracy, what you're saying, but just like, there's things that people are doing that's in their own economic or political self-interest to do, and it's not serving the ultimate cause that they claim they're serving. So, okay, so I guess the other thing you brought up was that I would like to ask you about is, basically is Trump smart or lucky, kind of that basic thing. Like, does he know what he's doing, or he's just kind of like fallen like ass backwards into this crazy situation, or does he even really want to be president? Like, did he think that he could ever win? And this is it's like the movie The Producers is what people have said online. Like, he planned to fail, but he succeeded with it, while trying to fail. So like that kind of thing. So I think, which one of those do you want to tackle?
I actually think all three of those things you just said have merit. I think that he was smart enough to understand that announcing his candidacy during the slowest news period of the year was perfect, because there was a void. And he filled that void, and the conservative media was desperate for him to do it. They had nothing else to talk about. He did it in a big way. He produces ratings. There's no question about that. I mean, he'll be the first one to tell you Donald Trump means ratings. And he meant ratings during a very slow period. And once that explosion occurs, once he gets traction, once his rocket ship is allowed to take off into flight, now it's a whole new ball game, because now he's got leverage. He's a master at using leverage. And so he used his leverage.
Right. Oh, yeah.
He used his leverage to get more media attention, and the more media attention he got, the better his poll numbers. The better his poll numbers, the more media attention, and it just built on itself. Now, is he really is he a genius? No, there's a lot of luck involved. That's the second thing you mentioned. There is in fact a lot of luck involved in this. There have been some events that have occurred that were perfectly timed for him. Some terrorist attacks that I think probably helped him. Some caving by the Republican establishment in Congress that I think helped his narrative. I think Jeb Bush getting in the race and not getting out was the best thing that ever happened to Donald Trump. I think that if Jeb Bush doesn't get in the race, I think that Marco Rubio is far more in a far better position to take him on much earlier. I think Rubio beats Trump in Iowa if there's no Jeb Bush. I think Trump is then a third place finisher in Iowa, and that maybe some of the magic wears off of him before he gets to New Hampshire. I think the whole dynamic is different. And then the third thing that I think happened here with regard to whether he really wanted to win. This is a fascinating topic. You know, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a piece by a former Trump PAC supporter that came out yesterday where she basically says...
I was going to bring that piece up.
She says in her interview, now, again, you have to understand this, effectively it's a disgruntled employee, I guess. You could argue, at least Trump would, I'm sure, argue that. But she says that during her job interview, she was told, look, we don't have any interest in winning here. I'm paraphrasing. We don't have any interest in winning here. We just want to come in second. We want to run a good race. We want to increase our profile, our perception of power. You know, we really have no interest in winning this. Now, is that true? I don't know. But I will say this. You know, it's interesting that Trump is a golfer, and he talks a lot about choking. You ever notice that? He talks a lot about choking. He referred to Marco Rubio as a choker or a chalker, since he misspelled it on Twitter. And he refers to Mitt Romney as a choker all the time. Now, I'm a golfer myself. I don't know if you can see behind me, but, you know, there's a bunch of golf photographs. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that golf and choking are very connected. And I'm going to make, I think, an important point here. If Trump really wanted to win, if that was really his goal at this point, I really don't believe he would have been able to not take the foot off the accelerator on the politically incorrect stuff. In other words, let's pretend that Trump, even Trump didn't think he could do this, right? But then it starts happening. And not only is he leading, he's the presumptive nominee. At some point, if you use a car analogy, you start to put the foot on the brake and you go, whoa, I don't want to blow this. I'm going to be president. There's been none of that with Trump. Zero. Then that indicates to me that at least somewhere in the back of his head, he doesn't really care if he wins or not. Now, does that mean he doesn't want to win? I don't know. But I think you can make an argument. I think you can make a very strong argument that it's in his self-interest at this point to have the nomination stolen from him. Because if it's stolen from him, he's still the winner. The establishment took it, and he doesn't have to endure a humiliating loss to Hillary, which is what's going to happen if he's the nominee. So if you look at it from Trump's personal self-interest, now whether he's smart enough and self-aware enough to understand this, I don't know. But if you look at it from that perspective, I think there's a part of him that should want to have the nomination stolen from him because that's the best outcome for him in the long run.
Yeah. Okay. This is fascinating stuff. So a couple things I want to touch on. The first one is you mentioned leverage. That's a fascinating metaphor that I hadn't heard before because that's what a real estate developer does. They put up 1%. They get the bank to put up 95%, and they get some chumps somewhere else to put up 4%. And then they build the thing. You know, they're highly leveraged. They build the thing. The thing is built. They get their money back. You know, they make like 10 times as much as they put in. And then they're gone. And that's what Trump does because he doesn't own a lot of the buildings that he puts his name on. You know, he just sells his brand. And who knows if he's even putting in the work that a normal developer would do. He's just selling himself, and he's highly leveraged. And, you know, he's declared bankruptcy multiple times, which is kind of what can happen if you are going in with a highly leveraged position. You're going to lose sometimes. And then you use the bankruptcy courts if you're a savvy businessman like Donald J. Trump. So yeah, I think that's a great metaphor, and I feel like someone could maybe you should just write a piece all about Trump's leverage
Well, and
over the GOP.
by the way, this is an important point, and not just explaining how he's gotten here, but also why it's gonna, if he wants to win, which might be a big if, why it's going to be very difficult to take this away from him at a contested convention. Because at a contested convention, you're playing into all of Donald Trump's strengths. A contested convention will be all about two things: manipulating the media and making deals with leverage. Now, who's better at those two things than Donald Trump? You're going to take Donald Trump on in his absolute wheelhouse at a contested convention. So,
okay, that's possible. But I think what could also happen is that, I mean, what this crazy process has also shown is that, like, he's really flying by the seat of his pants and doesn't have like a real kind of on the ground organization that someone like Ted Cruz has.
I agree. Let me tell you, I 1,000% agree with that. I think from a formulaic standpoint, from a strategic perspective, it's easy to steal this nomination from Trump. I mean, the whole Trojan delegate thing is real. I don't know how much you've read about that, but that is real and very easily pulled off. So if he doesn't get 1237 on the first ballot, I don't think Trump ever wins the nomination, ever, because I think he's going to be slaughtered in the second or third ballots. But I do think that Trump is going to be formidable, assuming he wants to win. He's going to be formidable in getting that 1237 because he's going to have a lot of advantages that play to his strengths.
Right. And so then the question, does he actually want it? So there's this piece, which we will link to. It went up strangely at the website XOJane. I don't know why they ran it.
That was weird. I agree with you that was weird. That didn't make a lot of sense.
But so the headline of this piece is an open letter to Trump voters from his top strategist turned defector. The author's name is Stephanie. I'm going to mispronounce her last name, something like Segilski. We will link to it. I was joking on Twitter that this essay would be like on the AP US history exam in 20 years as like a primary source document that like students need to analyze to figure out like what was happening in American politics right now and like write essays about. Like, this is a fascinating document that like should go in the Smithsonian. It's just amazing. It's basically the woman is, she says what you've been saying, that Trump, had this as kind of like more like a business opportunity, a way to, build his brand, self-aggrandize, and he never planned to win. And somehow he ended up winning. So that's kind of like he wanted to place second and then have some power and feel like a big guy and sell steaks or neckties or whatever. And somehow he's ended up winning. And what's allowed him to win is kind of another metaphor I've been using on Twitter. Is kind of like the GOP, like without anyone knowing it, like has cancer. And then like Trump was like an infection. And like a healthy body would have been able to fight off the Trump infection. But the GOP had like a fatal illness. And so the Trump infection, or the Trump parasite, maybe I guess parasite is a better metaphor, was able to take over this sick body of the GOP and is going to kill the GOP. The GOP, I think, is finished as a national political party. The party's going to split in half. And the American system is set up so that it's a two-party system. That's a cliche, but it's true. It's very hard for a third party to, take power. And that's why the Republican Party was able to come to prominence in the 1860s, because the Whig Party folded. And then, with winner-take-all elections, you can't really have a viable third party. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but I really do think that Trump accidentally is like going to kill the GOP. So as a conservative, what do you think about that?
I think your cancer analogy is pretty good. I think the Trojan horse analogy might be a little bit better, because in my analogy, the gatekeepers who allowed the Trojan horse into the city are the conservative media, and they were in on it. They had no problem with this because it was nice drama for them, and that's all they care about. All they want is content, drama, and ratings. And in fact, the worst thing that can happen to them is to have a boring conservative win. That's death for the conservative media. People don't understand that. That is absolute death. I mean, if let's pretend that Scott Walker, who on paper I believe would have had the easiest path to beating Hillary Clinton. If you think about getting to 270 electoral college votes, or at least 269, which is all you need as a Republican, because then the House would give it to the Republican, because that's how it works. If you think about 269 electoral college votes, Scott Walker with Marco Rubio as his vice presidential nominee, which, by the way, Walker talked about back when he was in the race as a possibility. If you took Walker and Rubio, Hillary has no chance, barring, some catastrophic event, because of the way that the map would work out. However, if that occurred, that would be horrific for the conservative media. Scott Walker is boring to the conservative media. He's white bread. He's from Wisconsin. There's nothing thrilling about him. And if he's in power, if the conservatives let's imagine, conservatives are control the White House, the Senate, and the House. There's no boogeyman. There's no danger. There's nothing. There's nobody to fight. And there's nobody to criticize. So that is a horrible situation for the conservative media. Fox News Channel would lose enormous amounts of audience. Talk radio, which is already struggling because of a broken business model, would be in big, big trouble. So, that, unfortunately, the best scenario for the Republican Party was the worst scenario for the conservative media.
Okay, why? So this is a great mystery to me. I haven't seen a good explanation for it. Why did Scott Walker drop out?
It's very easily understood. When Scott Walker got in, he was the favorite. And in fact, Matt Drudge, interestingly, seemed to take a liking to him. And I was starting to think, okay, he might be able to pull this thing off. Well, the moment Trump got in, Drudge dropped Scott Walker like an ugly girlfriend and moved on to the hottie, Donald Trump. And Walker had created an infrastructure, especially in Iowa and New Hampshire, that was based on him being a front runner. Well, he was no longer the front runner, so he was spending money like a front runner, but because Trump had changed the entire dynamic. I mean, Trump was like a hurricane that came in, and everybody's boats got capsized, and Scott Walker's like, what the hell just happened? I mean, Walker didn't make any mistakes. I mean, some people who wanted to believe that they wanted to rationalize why he was forced out, because we want to believe, right, that somehow rationality has some role in this. So he didn't run a good campaign, or he wasn't exciting enough, or he wasn't ready. That's my favorite one. He wasn't ready, but Trump's ready, right? So somehow he gets judged on this absurd standard, especially what Trump's getting away with. And he was just spending too much money. And I think he realized, to his credit, he realized this is a circus. I'm not the type of guy that's going to win a circus, because I'm not Mr. Excitement. And I'm not able to bring in money anymore because my poll numbers stink. And, he was right. When he pulled out, he said, I'm calling on others to drop out as well. That means you, Jeb Bush, which he didn't say, but that's what he meant. And had Jeb Bush heeded that instead of putting his own ego ahead of the party and the country, I think we would be in a very, very different place right now.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So what that makes me think is, like, maybe, Walker is smarter than kind of the media consensus is giving him credit for, and maybe he kind of saw what was going to happen, and he was like,
I believe
so.
Yeah.
I can't win now. I might as well just go back to Wisconsin, buy my time. In 2020, it's a new election. I think that's kind of Paul Ryan's belief also. Like, there's, people are like, oh, well, they'll draft Paul Ryan at the convention. I mean, Paul Ryan is smart. He knows what's going on. He knows that the brand has been, like, really, really hurt, and Trump is going to lead some kind of, like, third-party, like, movement based around his celebrity. So, and he's the Speaker of the House, so he has an awesome job. So he is not going to, like, drop in and, like, parachute in and be their, like, savior at the convention, because he can see, like, he has a good, I mean, in 2020, things will be different, and crazy stuff happens every day in America. It's a crazy country. So he could have a great chance in 2020 running against President Hillary Clinton, and maybe there'll be a recession or something. So he could become president in 2020. There's no reason for him to run this year. So maybe that's what Walker was thinking. Like, he's like, I'll just buy my time, go back to Wisconsin, and see what happens.
I don't know if Walker was thinking about 2020. I just think he was smart enough to realize this is not going to work for me. And he did the right thing in urging others to drop out, but everyone's egos were too big. This was a lot about ego. Jeb Bush's ego, Chris Christie's ego, John Kasich's ego. I mean, these are people who really should have dropped out and by the way, in prior election cycles would have dropped out. In a traditional election cycle, after Iowa, Bush, Kasich, and Christie all would have been gone because they did so horribly in Iowa. That would have been it. And that would have changed everything because then Rubio, first of all, he wouldn't have had his Chris Christie episode with the debate, but he also would have been coming in, I believe, after a second place instead of a third place finish in Iowa. And I think he would have been the favorite, if not a strong second in New Hampshire. Then he wins South Carolina, and now everything's different.
Maybe. I mean, that's possible. But I mean, Rubio, like, I think Trump, I mean, what Trump is good at is that, like, he really is like a bully. And what a bully is good at is, like, identifying a person's weakness and then exploiting it. So, like, he really did see that Rubio was like a little. That Rubio was like. Well, that he's like a little boy. I mean, like little Marco, like people were making fun of it at first, and then like wait, he looks young, he's a good-looking guy, but like he's kind of been ill-prepared. Like he hasn't, he's only been in the Senate for a couple of years.
He's older than Kennedy.
Okay, but I mean, I didn't know Jack Kennedy, but Marco Rubio is no Jack Kennedy. I mean, come on, he like. Okay, well, I mean, he's like he choked. I mean, Kennedy never choked.
No. Wow, you have
I mean, he had okay, well, I have a personal theory about Marco Rubio that he has like an anxiety disorder, and that's why he sweats so much and is so nervous and talks so fast.
So the guy who has an anxiety disorder somehow marries a former Miami Dolphin cheerleader. And
he's a jock. I mean, that's the thing. That's the other piece of the bully thing, is that he's a jock. So, I mean, yeah, he's a jock. He was a football player in college, and like, yeah, he married the cheerleader. I mean, that's like, what else could a jock do but marry the cheerleader? So, like, the jock versus the bully, the jock doesn't know how to fight the bully, like the nerd knows how to fight the bully. So, and there were no nerds. I mean, Ted Cruz is kind of a nerd, and strangely, he survived.
Kind of.
Well, I think he's more like a total weirdo than a nerd, but okay, yeah. So I mean, it all goes back to high school.
Down in Marco Rubio. What else do you want to talk about?
Okay, so let's talk about the kind of the conspiracy theory part. So, like you said, I don't believe in conspiracy theories either, and there's no. I mean, it's kind of weird because you're saying that Drudge like does kind of manipulate things to his effect, but there's no like secret cabal like having a meeting every week and they're like, here's what's going to happen this week. So that doesn't happen. And there's this have you ever heard of the filmmaker Kirby Ferguson? He has this project that's called This Is Not a Conspiracy Theory, and he's kind of like telling American history through like the idea that there's no conspiracy theories. It's just kind of like capitalism and game theory and stuff like playing out. So there's no like hidden hand controlling events. But why does it seem like there's a conspiracy theory? Why do people think there is a conspiracy theory? Like, is Drudge like pulling the strings, or what? Like, how much power does Drudge really have?
It's a great question. Because with Drudge, you don't need a conspiracy because he's one man. And I do think he's pulling strings. Now, what people don't understand is what motivates Drudge. I don't think anybody fully knows what's motivating Drudge. Andrew Breitbart worked for him for 10 years and didn't know fully what's motivating Drudge. I think Drudge loves chaos more than anything.
Okay.
I mean, he loves chaos. I've always felt that eventually, when the stock market crashes, Matt Drudge will throw it further into the toilet because he is just waiting for that to happen. I mean, he wants chaos for whatever reason. He also wants money. He's an incredible businessman. He has created the greatest business model in the history of the internet, if not the history of history. I mean, all he does is he has a web page where he links to other people's work 99.9% of the time. That's all he does. And he makes millions and millions of dollars from it. Now, here's how it works. If Drudge makes it clear that he likes a particular narrative, and it's obvious that he's in the tank for Trump in a huge way this year. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So once he makes it clear through where he's linking that he is in love with the Trump narrative, what message does that send? There's no phone call made. There's no meeting. It sends a message to every reporter whose goal every day is to get linked on Drudge. And that is, Drudge is on the Trump bandwagon. So if I write about a bogus poll that's not even a poll claiming that Trump might win New York, which is what the New York Post did a few weeks ago, there's a darn good chance Drudge is going to link to it. And if Drudge links to it, I'm a success that day. Maybe, by the way, I might be a success that week, depending on the publication. Right. So now everyone is looking around for, oh, how can I get a little piece of this Trump gravy train? It's kind of like a trickle-down theory. It's also like a magnet. Whatever Drudge wants the narrative to be is a magnet for people who need internet traffic. Oh, Drudge is on robots. Let's do something on robots. I mean, everyone knows Drudge hates Hillary, or at least will post anything that's negative Hillary. So we get 8 million Clinton email stories because there's a good chance they'll get linked on Drudge. Well, and the same, by the way, works in the opposite direction. Nobody's going to write a story on Rubio back when he was in because it ain't going to get linked on Drudge. It's not that exciting. You're not going to get much internet traffic. So, and the same thing happened with Scott Walker. So Trump becomes, he becomes traffic bait, clickbait. And it's all because of Matt Drudge. And Rush Limbaugh, who's friends with Matt Drudge, followed. And so did, for a while, so did Mark Levin. Sean Hannity has basically become an arm of the Trump campaign. It's been humiliating and embarrassing. Ann Coulter is basically driving the Trump bus. She is very close to Matt Drudge. It's basically this cabal that Drudge leads, even though he doesn't have a lot of interaction with them because he's kind of a hermit. But he doesn't need that much interaction. You see what he's thinking every day at the Drudge Report. And so, like for instance, Drudge has not linked one time to this Ted Cruz infidelity story, which is fascinating to me. I find that incredibly interesting. I haven't figured out what it means yet, but because he hasn't linked to it, and now the message is out, he's not interested in it, it decreases the incentive for anybody else to write about it because you're not going to get linked on Drudge. So
so this is amazing. This is amazing stuff. So I mean, what it makes me think is that it's almost like there's some kind of metaphor on the tip of my tongue. So it's like Drudge is like like the king of like France in like 1600, and like the courtiers all like interpreting like every little like motion he makes. Like he flicked his hand towards me. Like very good, very good. They're like they don't get the direct messages, but it's like what is Drudge thinking today? We need to interpret it. And then the other metaphor is like they're drug addicts. They get addicted to the traffic, and then if who's working for who? I mean, this is a metaphor that David Frum has been writing about for a while. Conservatives thought Fox News worked for them, and they found out that they worked for Fox News. And a lot of these people literally work for Fox News. Sarah Palin literally worked for Fox News. I don't know if she still does. Newt Gingrich. A lot of these people get a paycheck from Fox News, and they are primarily entertainers. They are not primarily politicians anymore. So it's a very strange course of events. So how did why? And like you said, Drudge's website hasn't changed like its design or like the way he works in like 15 years. Like how did this crazy? Do you have any idea how this came to be? That like this website, like a blog essentially from 1999, like is pulling the strings of like a major political party. Like this is insane. Like how did this come to be?
Well, it came to be because he broke the Monica Lewinsky story. And interestingly enough, he broke the Monica Lewinsky story because NBC passed on it, and the reporters, which makes him not jumping on the Cruz thing even more interesting. So he breaks the Monica Lewinsky story, he becomes famous, and because 90% of the mainstream news media is liberal, there is an inherent market for somebody who has a more conservative bent. Where can you go for conservative news? And, Fox News Channel hadn't been established really at that point. And so Drudge becomes the guy. I mean, it was almost inevitable that there would be one guy in the internet age that would get that piece of land, and Drudge got it. And he's been very effective at keeping it.
Okay, yeah, but like, why 15 years? If I was a reporter who broke the Lewinsky scandal, I think my editor would, and I was still like, dining out on it. 15 years later, my editor would say, "What have you brought me lately? Like, why hasn't anyone like stolen Drudge's spot, or like,
Because
why is he still in charge?"
it's a good question, especially, I mean, knowing what I've known, and I mean, I've tried to get the word out, but I'm just one guy with a limited platform. I mean, I think he hurt our chances in 2008 dramatically. I think he helped Romney win in 2012, which I thought was a good thing, because I thought Romney had the best chance of beating Obama. And then he's completely created catastrophe in 2016 with the whole Trump thing. I think it's one of those things where, I don't know, it's kind of like, why did AT&T, they were the first, right? So
okay, so like path dependency is the term for this. It's like, why I can only use like Time Warner cable modems where I live in Western New York, because like, once Time Warner cable established the monopoly on it, like it doesn't make sense for Verizon to come in and like lay all the cables and stuff, and that's like billions of dollars of infrastructure. So I'm forced to use Time Warner Cable's rather mediocre internet system because they have a local monopoly. So it's kind of like Drudge like established a monopoly, and then no one could push him off. Like, is that the right metaphor?
I think that's decent. I mean, obviously there are other conservative news sources, but I mean, he's the one that gets the most traffic. He's the one with the most power. I'll tell you where else. He's basically the assignment editor for Fox News Channel. I mean, every producer at Fox News Channel is constantly checking the Drudge Report. So if something's on the Drudge Report, that means Fox News Channel producers are at least aware of it. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do the story, but they're at least aware of it. And everybody else in the conservative blogosphere is checking the Drudge Report, and the same thing happens with them. And frankly, Rush Limbaugh at this point is so mailing it in. I think he just gets in an hour beforehand and looks at what's on the Drudge Report, and that's what I'm going to talk about. And Sean Hannity,
and then he goes golfing the rest of the day.
Right. So I mean, that's the power of Drudge, and it's genius in its simplicity. But you also have to give him credit. He has a very good sense for what people are interested in, and I think that's the key to his success. I have in some ways, I have a lot of respect for Drudge, although I do believe what he's doing is going to end up causing eventually the destruction of the country.
Okay.
But it will make him some money. So I hope he's happy. I hope he's real happy with the money he makes from this Trump thing, because it's going to end up destroying everything.
Okay. So the last point on this before we shift to talking about David Foster Wallace, is you mentioned Drudge wants chaos, and chaos is good for Drudge. I mean, chaos is good for a lot of the media. Like, if there's chaos, like let's say there was you just like heard like something crazy was happening. Like, what are you gonna do? Like, you're gonna turn on CNN. Like what's happening? I'm gonna turn on CNN. Like, for everything that sucks about CNN. Like, if there's breaking news, that's their slogan. It's like, breaking news. This is CNN.
I agree with that. I go to CNN if there's breaking news.
Yeah, it became almost a parody like in the past couple of years, because it's like there's a plane crash. CNN is on the case. Missing plane. Like CNN like turned into the missing plane network because
right.
they saw a cash cow here. So it's like the mainstream media, even though the individual reporters are probably horrified personally by what Donald Trump is doing and would never vote for him in a million years, they benefit from this whole crazy cycle. And I was joking on Twitter earlier, like how many like home renovations are going to get made because of the Trump campaign, like among CNN like low-level executives. People are like calling their contractors and saying like, no, let's go for the marble finishes on this. Like a lot of money is being made by everyone through this circus, and the country is being hurt. But
the head of CBS,
this is breaking news.
I assume you saw it. The head of CBS,
yeah,
said directly, it's not good for the country, but it's good for CBS News. I mean, You can't get more clear than that.
Yeah, and if that's capitalism. People are going for their self-interest.
But journalism was supposed to be different. I mean, see, when journalism became a business, which it was required, what changed here, and I predicted this all in a book in 2005, which nobody paid any attention to, called The Death of Free Speech. the fragmentation of the news media has caused all this, because the fragmentation of the news media destroyed the business models of all the major media outlets. See, it used to be, back in the glory days, when there were 4 channels and no cable news networks, that even if you had a radio station, forget about a TV station, just a radio station was a license to print money. I mean, making money was not even a question. It was just about how much money you were going to make. So therefore, you could afford to keep a firewall between the business side and the journalism side. Mm-hmm. Well, now that the business models have all collapsed and it's no longer a license to print money, now that firewall is a puddle because it's been extinguished. There is no firewall. As a matter of fact, news and business are basically intertwined. And some of these outlets don't even make any bones about it anymore. They don't even pretend. It's a flat-out joke. So journalism has been killed by media fragmentation, but no one wants to admit it or notice it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. But then that gets back to this whole thing about local monopolies. Like the TV networks could afford to have this like high-minded, like we are serving the public interest because they had a monopoly. They had all this money coming in no matter what. When there's 4 networks, you can put on crap and people are going to watch it because there's nothing else on. When there's no place else to run your classified ad, you have to pay the local newspaper to run your classified ad. When there's Craigslist, the local newspaper, needs a new revenue source. And it used to be like the classified ad, the guy who was like attending the city council meetings and like reporting on like the shenanigans that were going on locally. Like, so that system is dying. That can't exist anymore. And so now it's like, it's like BuzzFeed is like, what BuzzFeed does is they run like quizzes and like things about like, these 37 giraffe babies, like will teach you how to be a better, person today. And then like, so that's like the version of, that's what everyone really wants to see. They don't want to read about, the local investigative news stories. And then like BuzzFeed has like a news operation now. So they're funneling some of it back into reporting instead of like.
Let me make one other point on this, because this is really important. Not only did media fragmentation come around in the last 15 to 20 years, but the other critical thing, and this goes right to the Donald Trump phenomenon, because without this, there is no Donald Trump phenomenon. It wasn't too long ago when TV, especially local TV stations, only got ratings in May and November. That was it. Mm-hmm. May and November. And by the way, they didn't get the results of those ratings for weeks, if not months. So
okay, so this is like the sweeps period?
Yes, the sweeps period. I guess February was also a sweeps month. So February, May, and November were the only months that got rated, and there was no instantaneous ratings. So let's pretend that world existed in now with Donald Trump. The networks wouldn't know that Donald Trump was this great ratings bonanza until it was too late, right? And by the way, that was partially by design, so that television wouldn't just dive after every ratings. Now, today, we know the next morning at 11 a.m. Eastern, not only which stories popped and which didn't, we know to the minute, literally to the minute, which story on a television network people tuned into and which they turned off. And that means, and I've run into buzzsaws in stories that I've done. I've had interviews canceled by major networks because this is a funny story, weird funny story. Since you mentioned the missing airplanes, right? Okay, yeah. So this story's a good one. So I told you I was involved in the Penn State case, and I had done a Today Show interview with Matt Lauer, along with Dottie Sandusky, the wife of Jerry Sandusky. All right, and the next day, we did a CNN interview, all right? The CNN interview was scheduled to air that night on the Anderson Cooper show, and I was going to be on with Anderson Cooper. We got told, after I flew to New York from State College, Pennsylvania, that the interview had been canceled for breaking news. I'm like, what? There is no breaking news. Well, this was in the middle of the Malaysian plane crash. What I was able to piece together later was, and the crash had occurred like a week before, all right? What I was able to piece together was, and I could even tell from the time period and when the emails happened and when I got the news from the producer, was that here was their breaking news. At 11 a.m. that morning, they found out, holy crap, we've got a hit with the Malaysian missing flight. We're canceling everything else. We're going all in on the flight. So that's now breaking news. Breaking news is we have a hit. That is, and what I'm telling you is 100% true. And
I believe it.
That is what is breaking news now. Holy shit! Look, we got a hit last night. Let's go with it. Cancel everything. And that's what happened. That's what happened with Donald Trump. Holy cow! Everything. If Trump calls in, we abandon everything because he gets ratings. And we wouldn't have known that even 10, 15 years ago. We wouldn't have known that. But because of the technology with regard to ratings, now we do.
Okay, yeah, this is fascinating. Just the last point I'll make, and then maybe you can make whatever last point you want to make, and then we'll shift to talking about David Foster Wallace just for a couple minutes. You are conservative. I'm not a conservative. I guess I would call myself kind of like a centrist liberal, or maybe, I guess liberal is a moving target. But the way you're talking, it's almost like a kind of Marxist reading of like the news business. So you're saying it's not about ideology. It's not about like these great ideas. It's just about making money. And like various people have figured out how to kind of like game the system in a way that can make them money. So the CNN executive realizes that they get better ratings when they're covering the missing Malaysian plane. And Matt Drudge figures out he gets better ratings when Donald Trump is the candidate instead of boring old Scott Walker. So it's kind of like, follow the money, who benefits, this kind of like, look at, and there's technological stuff, technological progress, like the fact that, the Nielsen families used to like write their shows down on a piece of paper and mail them in, and now it's all electronic. So we have all this stuff, and it's kind of like almost like a weird looking like inevitability to it, because inevitably like the technology was going to change, and there were going to be cable networks, and these monopolies are inevitably going to be broken up. Like, what do you think about this kind of like? I mean, it's not like Marxist in like the communist sense, but kind of like Marxist analysis of like the situation. Like what do you think about that?
It's the only thing you've said so far that I'm not sure I understand. I'm not sure where Marxism comes into this.
Well, kind of like, looking at economic determinism, Marx thought that like the proletariat would inevitably rise. So he was like wrong about that. But he was kind of right in seeing that like it had to deal with like who has the money and who has the power, not like whether like, these great ideologies or these great religions or whatever were like controlling things. It was about money and power. And
okay. I guess I see where you're going with that. Since you're a liberal, I'll accept that you're the expert on Marx. But look, to me, I think this is very simple. That a bunch of people have realized it's kind of like the big. You use Marx, I'll use Hitler. It's more like the big lie theory.
Okay.
And the big lie theory is the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. And to the rank and file conservative, they have been because of the liberal media bias. See, this is an incredibly important part of this equation. Conservatives feel so put upon by the overt liberal media bias in the mainstream news media that they embrace people like Limbaugh and Hannity and O'Reilly and Drudge, and they think, wow, thank God, you're our life preserver. We trust you. Without you, where would we be? So there's an incredible amount of loyalty to these people when it's completely misplaced, because in fact they have a self-interest in conservatives losing, which conservatives could never most conservatives, although I think some are starting to see it based upon the reaction to my article. I mean, my article was shared 25,000 times on Facebook, which is ridiculous for a non-celebrity. So I think some conservatives are starting to see the light, but it's the big lie theory. The bigger the lie, the more people will believe it.
Okay. So, we could talk about this for an hour, I feel like, or another additional hour into almost the hour we've been speaking about it. But I do want to talk about David Foster Wallace. This is his book, Consider the Lobster. It's the last book of nonfiction he published while he was still alive. So when I read this piece that we been talking about, I was like, oh wow, this is amazing. This is really interesting. And I scrolled up to see who wrote it. I saw John Ziegler. That name sounds familiar to me. And then I Googled and I said, oh my God, this is the same guy who was profiled in an article called Host by David Foster Wallace, who's one of my favorite authors. And he wrote it in a very unusual way. I'm just holding it up to the camera. So usually David Foster Wallace is famous for kind of like these footnotes and stuff. But he did it when it ran in the Atlantic. I was like 24 when this story came out. I went out and bought the Atlantic, and it was like all these color-coded boxes and stuff. So they reprinted it in the actual when it came out in the book, they're reprinted this way, so it's like all these arrows. It's kind of confusing, but it's an interesting piece. And so what was it like having David Foster Wallace? Like, what was he like, interviewing you, and what was it like when the story came out?
Well, I think you're going to find this so very disappointing in a lot of ways, but you can determine that. First of all, I'm somewhat ashamed as to how this whole thing happened, because a lot of it happened because of my own ignorance. I don't really do a lot of reading outside of news. So when I got a letter as a radio talk show host in Los Angeles at KFI, I got a letter from David Foster Wallace asking me if I would be willing to have him shadow me for a couple of months for a story he was doing. I had no idea who David Foster Wallace is. Now, I realize that this is blasphemy to the literary world, where he was some great genius. And this was, I think, as it sounds, I don't even think I was aware of Google at that time. I never even bothered to Google the guy. And because I have nothing to fear, I said, okay, sure, whatever. And I'm thinking, by the way, this guy is probably some nobody. This is never going to see the light of day. No big deal. Well, my suspicions of that were further amplified when I met the guy, because he was exceedingly unimpressive in person. He appeared to be borderline homeless, unwashed, unkempt, smelled, was bizarre.
He was very sweaty. I know that he famously wore bandanas. He's not wearing one in his author photo here, but he wore bandanas. People thought it was an affectation, but it was because he sweated constantly. So he was self-conscious, so he wore the bandana so that sweat wasn't dripping down his face.
Yeah, I have to say he was an exceedingly unimpressive person in person. There was nothing he said once to me in the 2 or 3 months that he shadowed me that I found to be, wow, boy, this guy is really smart. And by the way, through the entire process, I had no idea who he was. No idea. And this actually gets rather comical, because so the 2 or 3 months ends. He buys me dinner to do a formal interview to end the thing. And then I don't hear about it for at least another 10 months, maybe a year. And I'm like, to the point where I actually forgot that he had done this. And I actually contacted him, and I said, yo, whatever. And by the way, I'm thinking I'm calling him because I'm going to, hey, you were obviously a fraud. You told me this thing was going to come out. Nothing ever happened. He said, no, don't worry about it. It's coming out soon. So I got a call from Atlantic Monthly, the magazine, or I guess it was Atlantic then. They changed the name. From their fact checker. Incredibly questions, all of which probably could have been figured out on Google. And I'm like, really? That's all they're going to ask me? This must really be a pretty short piece. Well, then without any warning whatsoever, all of a sudden, the Atlantic magazine comes out. It's the cover story. It's 23 pages. As you've already alluded to, it's got all these bizarre boxes and arrows. And I have somebody named Foster Wallace instead of David Foster Wallace had sent that piece to Atlantic. They would have laughed at him and said, please come back when you learn how to write. And they never would have dreamed of publishing it. But because he's David Foster Wallace, and because of infinite jest and, he's such a frickin' genius, and, David Foster Wallace, it must be genius. It's bizarre to us, but it must be genius because it's David Foster Wallace. So when it comes out, I'm reading the first paragraph, and I realize that there's 3 or 4 blatant inaccuracies in the first paragraph. In the first paragraph, there are 3 or 4 things about me that are wrong. Now, they're not like critical facts, but they're wrong. in the first paragraph. So
Okay.
I call David Foster Wallace up and I say, all right, you're going to have to come on my show to talk about this. And he refused. He refused to do it. I gave him 2 or 3 months, all in exchange for one dinner, and he wouldn't even come on my radio show to do an interview about this. And I blasted him on the phone. I mean, I believe I actually treated him so badly on the phone, I thought about calling back to apologize, which I never do, because I was that pissed off and that ripped that he would not do an interview with me after I gave him 2 or 3 months and gave him a 23-page inaccurate article. Now, my theory on the article is he intended originally to do a hatchet job on me and talk radio. But that after 2 or 3 months, he kind of sort of a little bit liked me. And so the hatchet job became slightly changed from a complete hatchet job to a half hatchet job. And so I mean, I have another thing to say about his suicide, but why don't you, I'm sure you have plenty of questions you want to ask about that. So
yeah,
that's my experience with David Foster Wallace.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, so I was an English major in college. I was a big David Foster Wallace fan. I mean, since he killed himself in 2008, a lot has come out about him. So he obviously had mental health problems. He suffered from depression a lot of his life. He was a drug addict and an alcoholic. He was, I think, a genius, but he obviously had a number of personal demons. He was probably an asshole. Great artists are often assholes. But that doesn't excuse me. An asshole to someone.
I didn't think he was an asshole. He was very nice. I mean, he was not an asshole, other than
just a weirdo, I guess.
Yes, weirdo.
But what's fascinating to me about how this all played out is kind of like, okay, so he got the facts wrong. So it's actually come out that like he tried to write nonfiction for the New Yorker, and he never published any. He published fiction with the New Yorker, but never published any nonfiction. And the New Yorker famously has a very stringent fact-checking process, and he wrote these pieces that were ostensibly nonfiction, but I think he probably made up facts or conflated stuff or invented characters or made stuff up to basically tell a better story. So I mean, he was primarily a fiction writer.
I will tell you,
but he wrote some great nonfiction, but probably some of it was made up.
Well, that dovetails with my experience 100%, because he was pretending to do a nonfiction, but I think his true nature just kind of took over, and he decided, well, for instance, if you read, I don't know if you have that there with you, but in that first paragraph, he talks about how and this is just the one thing that I remember, he talks about how I lugged a U-Haul trailer across the country from Louisville to Los Angeles when I moved there after I had gotten fired in Louisville and rehired in Los Angeles. Well, that's, I guess, makes it more colorful, but there was no U-Haul. There was no U-Haul. I had all my stuff taken here by a moving van, and I just drove myself in my Toyota Camry from Louisville to Los Angeles. And where he got the idea I was lugging a U-Haul, I have no idea. But I mean, that's just one example of where in his mind that wasn't interesting enough. So I'm lugging a U-Haul.
So he invented details in the same way that if he's writing a piece of fiction, he invents everything. And then when he's writing nonfiction, he apparently was just inventing stuff to tell a better story. So that's not a good way to write nonfiction. But I guess I'm not going to excuse, kind of him inventing stuff and, calling it nonfiction, call it gonzo journalism or something. I'm sure that Hunter S. Thompson was not really using all those drugs that he claimed he was using when he was going through Las Vegas and so on and so forth. But kind of like, so what I remembered about this piece, and the reason I thought it was so interesting that you wrote your piece and what a decade ago was the subject of his profile, was kind of like, it seems to me that what he identified and the essential thing he was talking about was kind of like why conservative talk radio is popular. Like it seems like the question you wanted to answer. And then you're writing about why the conservative movement is like cracking up and how a lot of it is just a scam. So like, how do you reconcile these two pieces of what you're thinking now and like the fact that you were a talk radio, I mean, you still are a talk radio host, but what do you, this is not a real question, but like, how do you reconcile all this stuff?
Well, I think that David Foster Wallace made some interesting points in the article. I mean, it is an interesting read. It's not all 100% bull crap. I mean, I don't think it's totally fair to me. Some of the things are out of context. And like I said, I think he intended to do a full hatchet job and turned into a half hatchet job. I think talk radio has changed a bit. I think that even in the 10 years or so since that article came out, that the business model, as I've referenced earlier, has gotten much worse for talk radio. I mean, I'm talking much, much worse. And so I think that it's a much more fraudulent business today than it was even then. You know, and I think my experience kind of proves that. You know, I'm doing a weekend show now instead of a weekday show. And I don't think I could do the same show I did at KFI today because it wouldn't work business-wise. I just don't think I don't think it would last. I don't think we'd be able to sell the advertising. The business model of my weekend show is totally different. And I happen to be the CEO of the corporation, so I can't get fired. I think even though it's a short period of time, I think the world has totally changed since when David Foster Wallace wrote that. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily, even though it's the same industry, I think it's so different now that I'm not sure that it's that relevant. It's really, the business model is broken. It is totally broken.
Right. So I guess, well, maybe my final question is like, so, you know, like a portrait of you that is, you know, not entirely, like you said, a half-hatchet job is, you know, immortalized in this book that people are going to be reading for 100 years. Like so people who read this and then like read, you know, like let's say the piece that you wrote, that we started this conversation talking about, like, I think you could turn this into a book. I think it's a great thesis, and there's a lot there. Like, you know, what do you want? Like, if someone read this and like they read your piece, like, what do you want them to like make of like, you know, all this information?
Well, I do think if they read the David Foster Wallace piece, they're going to realize that, boy, this Ziegler guy is honest. Says what he thinks, doesn't bull crap around, which is all true. You know, I really don't care what people think of me, for better or for worse. I mean, most people, even in talk radio, a lot of people do it, or in any media, because they want to be loved. I really couldn't care less about being loved, because I don't care enough about people to be loved. So therefore, it frees me up to say whatever the hell I want to say. And I happen to be right more often than almost anybody else I know. In fact, I'm right more often than anybody else I know in the media, because most people in the media are morons. And that goes for all sorts of different areas of life, and my predictions are uncannily good. As far as David Foster Wallace is concerned, you know, I guess it's weird that it is possible, as you said, maybe 100 years from now, the only record left of John Ziegler will be the fact that I was featured in the last paragraph of his last book. And I guess that will be weird, although I won't be around. Maybe my daughter will find that particularly odd, but maybe she'll enjoy that. I don't know. But, you know, before Foster committed suicide, and I think it's important to point out, although I don't think I can prove it, because I don't know that there's any evidence of it, but you'll just have to trust me. Before Foster committed suicide, and I said publicly that I believe that Foster is a fraud, and that he has a great fear of being found out as a fraud. Mm-hmm. Because when you're considered to be a genius, especially at a young age, that's an enormous amount of pressure. Mm-hmm. And I think Foster Wallace, by the way, it's actually in the trailer of the David Foster Wallace movie, which, by the way, has that come out yet? Okay, it's in the trailer.
Yeah, it came out last year, yeah.
Okay, well, if you watch the trailer of the David Foster, this shocked me. I almost wanted to sue for plagiarism, because when Foster Wallace killed himself, I said, to much controversy, and put out a piece on my website, I said... I
remember reading that piece in 2008.
I said... He knew he was a fraud. He feared being found out as a fraud. That's why he became weird, because if you're weird and people want to think you're a genius, they'll still think you're a genius. And that's why he killed himself, because when you kill yourself, you're a genius forever, because you're a tortured soul and you never get found out that you weren't that talented and that you're a fraud. Well, in the trailer of the David Foster Wallace movie, I forget the exact line, but the David Foster Wallace character actually says, I think I've lived most of my life fearing I would be found out as a fraud. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost word for word in the trailer of the movie. And so...
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's really interesting. So I remember reading that piece. So it was 8 years ago when he killed himself. I remember reading I remember where I was. I remember reading in the New York Times, and I couldn't believe it. I saw he was dead. I was like, was there an accident? Like, did he have cancer? So he killed himself. I was so shocked. And because he was older than me, but I kind of we're kind of a similar generation, and it was just so unbelievable. And then all this stuff coming out. He had substance abuse problems. He had mental health problems his entire life. I think he could fear being found out as a fraud and not actually be a fraud. Like, those are two different things. And like an artist, great art is subjective. So this guy, he published a 1,000-page book when he was like 28, and everyone said he was the greatest guy ever. And then what do you do after that? It's very hard to find a thing to do after that. You're not going to publish another 1,000-page book that everyone says is the new greatest thing. So yeah, he was kind of stuck. And he was on antidepressants. He changed antidepressant before he killed himself and kind of spiraled down into, the descriptions of it. There's a New Yorker piece describing his final months of life. It sounds hellish. So I think, I don't know I think in 100 years people will be reading David Foster Wallace. I don't know if they'll think he's the genius. I think he wrote true things about what's happening in America and the world in the late 90s and early aughts. But it's a lot of, it's like anyone who has early career success, and then what do they do next? If they can't top themselves, if they're 28 years old and everyone says you're the greatest guy ever, what do you do next?
I think you make a fair point about there being a distinction between fearing that you're found out as a fraud and being a fraud. However, the David Foster Wallace I knew, you have to remember, spent 2 or 3 months with him, him shadowing me, never saw one flash of brilliance. Not one. And I am somebody who, I actually think that my greatest talent is seeing talent in others. I'm very good at that. And I saw nothing with him. I saw absolutely nothing with him. And the article that he wrote about me, I thought was a mess. And as I already told you, was inaccurate in numerous ways. So in my experience, he feared being found as a fraud because either he always was, I didn't know him when he wrote Infinite Jest. So, Roger Federer piece is a good piece. That was interesting. But so I'm not saying he was the worst writer that ever lived, but the guy I knew was no genius. And whether he ran out of genius or never had it, I don't know. But when I have the fact that I had that theory before he killed himself, and then he does, and then it's in the trailer of the movie, I feel pretty confident that there's something to it.
Yeah. Have you read any of his other nonfiction? You read the Federer piece. Have you read any of his other nonfiction?
I may have. I don't remember.
It must be a bizarre, I can't even imagine what it would be like if someone followed me around for 2 months and then wrote a cover story for The Atlantic about what I was doing. Like, that just, it's bizarre. It's like having, your life, made into a TV movie or something. But some of his pieces, I think, are genius. He wrote a piece about going on a cruise. And it's called A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. It's a title essay in the work by the same name. It's hilarious. I've read it 3 or 4 times now. I read it last summer, just on a whim. I'll explain why. He grew up in rural Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. My wife grew up in rural Illinois as well. We were taking a trip out there. I was like, let me reread his piece about playing tennis. And as a kid, he was a teenage tennis star in the Midwest as a kid. I reread it. It's just kind of fun. We're going to be driving out there. He wrote this great piece about what's like being in the Midwest. And then I got sucked in and I reread all the pieces in there. And then I went back and reread a lot of Consider the Lobster. And we listened to the audiobook that he recorded as we were driving around the Midwest, my wife and I. And so he wrote, in some ways he was a genius, but like he was plagued by self-doubt, and like what depression and mental illness does to people is it tells you you're worthless, and that's what and he had great psychic pain. Like you can't commit suicide unless there's some like great psychic pain that you have inside you. So he could both be a genius and thought that he wasn't a genius because of mental illness and the bizarre circumstances of his early life success. That's just my opinion.
I have to say, though, as somebody who has also suffered from depression and has probably thought about killing themselves 1,000 times over the last, however many years of my life, but who has never come close to doing it, I don't have a lot of respect for those who did, especially when they leave other people behind. I think it's a cowardly way out, and so, look, I mean, I don't want to be too hard on a guy. I'm someone that's all inherently suspicious of any media darling, because the media is so incompetent that anybody they anoint almost has to be a fraud, because otherwise they wouldn't get anointed. If they were real, they wouldn't be considered to be a genius. So I'm just telling you what my experience with him was. I don't know if that changed your view of him or not, but I can assure you that this is not out of animus. I'm just telling you what happened and what I perceived